If nature could draw a map of the world, what would it look like? We've all grown accustomed to seeing our world divided into countries and states, but there's another way to see and better understand the planet we call home. In a few minutes, I'm going to unveil a new map of the world organized by bioregions, or as we like to call them, nature's countries. I'll explain how this map was created, but you're probably wondering, why a new map in the first place? Well, after the success of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, many of us were looking forward towards the UN Biodiversity Convention, which would be setting the global agenda for protecting nature. We knew that the targets set in the previous UN convention had not been sufficient, with now more than 2/3 of all land animals and 80% of freshwater species wiped out since the 1970s. It was 2017, and no one had yet aligned on a central target for the new convention. So our organization brought together some of the brightest minds to answer one vexing question. How much of the world's lands and seas do we need to conserve in order to solve the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change? The result was a paper published in 2019 called A Global Deal for Nature, which introduced in the scientific literature the 30 by 30 target, protecting and conserving 30% of lands and seas by 2030. With a big diplomatic effort, this target was adopted at the end of last year as part of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This was one major step towards a larger goal of protecting half of the planet. Now the work begins, and part of the work is rethinking how we organize collective action in the future. While the UN Convention is, of course, centered on nation states, nature organizes things in a different way. And we believe that in parallel with these important multilateral efforts, we need to be following nature's architecture if we're going to have a good success at preserving biodiversity as part of the global commons. We all just took a breath, given to us freely by nature, manufactured by oceanic plankton and trillions of trees that tirelessly absorb carbon dioxide from the air, releasing back oxygen through the process of photosynthesis. As Paulo Magalhães from Common Home of Humanity describes it, we have a global operating system for the planet, akin to a software system, which is owned by no one, but which regulates everything from weather patterns and precipitation to atmospheric conditions and even ocean tides. And while these processes are essential for life on Earth, they are wholly unacknowledged in our current global economic system. We'd be tempted to blame the Bretton Woods economists for all our troubles, for ignoring the now totally obvious fact that nature is the foundation of all economies, and if abused, can decline to oblivion. But back then in 1944, no one saw what was just coming around the corner. While a small group of scientists did know about climate change, no one knew just how fast the accelerated use of fossil fuels would turn our atmosphere into a hothouse, unleashing catastrophic impacts from severe storms and sea level rise to droughts and mass migrations. And since that time, we actually made things much worse, clearing nearly 1 billion hectares of forests, an area roughly the size of the United States. These forests are key to daily life, providing billions of people with fresh water and regulating our global climate system. The creators of our modern economy naively invented a world order that simply didn't price in the value of nature or the cost of destroying it. So 80 years on, we're careening towards an apocalypse that we all agree we want to avoid, but seem incapable of stopping. In order to succeed and survive in the coming decades, we will need a mechanism designed to ensure the longevity of the global commons, specifically remunerating the local communities that safeguard our ecosystems for the benefit of all humanity. Now let's dive into one ecosystem service, carbon flux, and how such a mechanism could work to support it. Carbon flux is like the earth breathing, releasing hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide up, then reabsorbing it back every year. This dynamic has been quite precisely balanced, but humans now add an additional 40 billion tons of CO2 per year. Nature, fortunately, is able to take on about half of that, storing it in oceans and forests, which is very lucky. If it weren't for them, we would all be toast for now. Here's how it works. In oceans, plankton absorb ambient carbon, and the krill gobble up the plankton. The whales gobble up the krill, depositing that carbon in deep ocean sediments. In forests, animals like toucans and tapirs act as seed dispersers, constantly planting new trees and shrubs. And other animals like elephants prune those trees, allowing ecosystems to store more carbon. Predators like wolves make sure that herbivores don't overgraze plants. This vast menagerie of plants and animals is what animates our global carbon cycle. And they do it all for free, but it should be for free. As we know, countries like Indonesia and Bhutan have allowed rampant deforestation. Why? Because in our current economic system, nature is only valuable when it's destroyed or harvested, not while it's standing. The first attempt to solve this problem was through the carbon markets, which allows polluters to offset their impacts by purchasing carbon credits and providing conservation funding. But this approach has led to some perverse incentives. Countries like Bhutan and Gabon, which have already done an excellent job preserving their biodiversity and forest, can't really access the carbon markets because credits are issued primarily based on the threat of deforestation. So the countries that cut the most trees down make the most money, not the other way around. In the long run, this approach won't be sufficient to provide the permanent funding needed to protect the global commons. So let's envision a system that could work and how a new map of the world can help in implementing the preservation of biodiversity. To protect the intricate web of life that makes carbon flux and other ecosystem services possible, it's estimated that we'll need about $600 billion per year in conservation funding. Currently, carbon credits, philanthropy, and government spending provide about $140 billion. So we have a big gap. How can we fill it? Well, let's imagine for a minute if we were able to insert a tiny, almost invisible transaction fee into the machinery of global capitalism. Every quarter, $750 trillion in currencies, stocks, and bonds are traded. If we were able to apply just 1 basis point or 0.1% to currency trades and another 4 basis points to stocks and bonds, that would generate an additional $380 billion in funding. In addition to helping stabilize markets in general, this tiny fee would largely close the biodiversity funding gap with a relative snap of the fingers. So how then would all that money get allocated? Well, peering into the future to envision this huge new flow of capital, one thing becomes clear. We'll need to think beyond a purely jurisdictional map of the Earth. So let's now dive into the bioregions framework, where we can think about allocating funds based on the specific needs of each ecosystem organized within the world's bioregions. The One Earth biogeographical framework was developed with input from many scientists and experts to delineate 185 discrete bioregions. What is a bioregion? A bioregion is a geographical area defined not by political boundaries, but by ecological systems. It is smaller in scale than a biogeographical realm, but larger in scale than an ecoregion or ecosystem. Conceptually, bioregions are subdivisions of the Earth's 14 main biomes, shown here, a classification of broad landscape types optimized for certain climate conditions across continents, from forest and grassland to deserts and tundra. These are further organized into component subrealms, aligning with well-known geographical regions like Amazonia, which straddles 8 different Latin American countries, or the Great Plains, which spans the continent of the United States. The bioregions are built upon a landmark 2017 study that delineated 844 terrestrial ecoregions. These are shown here. 5 rules were applied to delineate the bioregions, grouping closely related ecoregions across all realms. First, the bioregions have to be confined within a realm. They cannot cross over from one realm to another. Second, the bioregions divide the biomes by intersecting them with large-scale geological structures or climate zones. Third, bioregions are predominantly one biome type, but can incorporate ecoregions from another if they are closely interconnected together. Fourth, ecoregions are the building blocks of bioregions. They cannot be split between two bioregions, with the exception of mangroves that will cross long distances on the coast. And fifth, bioregions include the marine areas beyond the coastline, delineated by the EEZ boundaries, as these waters are biologically impacted by fishing and other impacts. With this new map of the world, we can now think about the flow of capital to protect critical ecosystems commensurate with the specific needs and conditions of each bioregion. Going back to our futuristic vision where we have $380 billion to spend on nature, we could deploy that capital against an inventory of intact natural habitat. Many of the same scientists that worked on the Global Deal for Nature paper published a geospatial analysis called the Global Safety Net, which compiled a sweeping inventory of remaining land that preserves ecosystem functionality. The results shown here, which were now being updated in high resolution, found that roughly 50% of the Earth's land is in a natural condition across 6 main classifications. But this land is not equally divided around the world. Some bioregions have a lot more intact natural habitat than others, and some areas like tropical forests and wetlands are more costly to maintain than others. So each bioregion needs its own strategy. Some of the most important land for biodiversity is found on indigenous territories, which shows the importance of securing land tenure and financial resources for these communities. Bringing together the bioregional framework with a routinely updated inventory of intact natural land, we can start to envision a new system to allocate huge amounts of capital for nature. Every bioregion could develop its own permanent trust, which would receive funds annually in perpetuity based on the extent of its natural habitat. These trusts could be designed for the specific needs of the local communities living within each bioregion, who are safeguarding the ecosystems, ensuring their vitality. This idea is in line with a concept called conservation basic income, which redistributes a portion of the net productivity of the global economy to those that are safeguarding nature. Through this approach, we can localize the global commons, providing a just, equitable, and science-based approach to preserving the biodiversity that makes all life on Earth possible.